You're listening to The Craft, a podcast for professional content creators who want to learn more about the people, process, and strategy behind the best content on the web. In each episode, we talk with writers, designers, and editors from the world's leading content teams and learn the secrets to their success. Let's jump in and get you inspired for your next story.
Hello and welcome to this episode of The Craft, brought to you by Shorthand. I'm Rachel Westbury, a senior editor here at Shorthand, and today I'm joined by a guest who believes that writing B2B content doesn't have to be boring. In fact, he thinks it shouldn't be. Beaming in all the way from the Blue Mountains in New South Wales, Australia, I'm very excited to welcome Jonathan Crossfield, a content writer and editor who specialises in unboring content marketing. Welcome, Jonathan.
Hi, and thank you for inviting me on.
I'm so thrilled that you're able to join us today. So to kick off today, Jonathan, can you please tell me a little bit about your career background and how you got to where you are today?
Well, I think like a lot of marketers I've worked with over the years, I fell into content marketing by accident. But so when I left school and went to uni and so on, I thought I was going to be working in TV or radio or working on Doctor Who or something like that. That was always the dream because I grew up obsessed with stories. And what I was really obsessed with was the storytelling that's in all of these things and how they hook me all the way through. So that's what I wanted to do. That was my passion as I went to uni. I eventually found myself as a copywriter for a web host based in Sydney. So I was doing SEO copywriting and web copy and all the rest of it for a few years. About the same time as I joined that company, they launched a magazine, not only for their subscribers, but it was also available in newsagents. So this was actually content marketing, and it was my first experience of that. And very soon I found myself running the magazine from the client's end, working with the agency that was producing it and writing for the magazine as well as, the copy stuff. And I realized this was my space. This is what I could do well. I had a magazine column, and I found out that what I was really wanted to do all this time is being a content marketer. So one of the themes that you'll notice out of that is almost all of that is B2B. And almost all of that is IT-based B2B as well. It's very technical stuff. And I think that's what I enjoy most about this, is actually making the incomprehensible comprehensible.
I certainly get the impression that that's something you're really passionate about flipping that on its head and making it engaging and accessible, right?
Yes. One of the challenges in B2B has always been this perception that if you're a business and you're talking to another business, that you need to write or produce content that is the term they would use, professional. What they normally mean when they say something like that is like it's written like it's a letter from a bank manager. It's very sort of Victorian. It uses lots of long words. It says utilize instead of use. There's lots of leveraging and synergies and all of that kind of stuff, because there's this idea that this tone of voice is more appropriate in business, which completely misses the point that all a business is a bunch of people, and people's brains don't somehow transform the moment they walk into the office at 9 o'clock in the morning. They don't switch from someone who was interested in Game of Thrones, at 8 o'clock to suddenly being someone who's interested in a very, very dry 10-page white paper about flanges or something. The communication that reaches these people shouldn't be that different, in my opinion. I mean, obviously there are differences in terms of the type of audience you're talking to. Different personas will respond to different tones or messaging, etc. And obviously you don't want to push the boat too far so that no one actually takes you seriously. But professional content is about professional communication. And if someone can't finish your piece of content because it's too boring or it's not holding their attention or they can't understand what it is you're trying to get across, then in my mind, that's not professional. Professional content is the stuff that gets read, and more better than that, gets remembered and gets actioned. So if that if getting people to read the content and to absorb it and be persuaded by it and act upon it requires you to communicate in a way that's more engaging, maybe even more fun, then that's professional.
I love that approach, Jonathan. I'm so excited for our chat today and to dig into this a little bit more. Look, as promised, we're going to dive into some of your defining career successes, whether that be a piece of content you've produced, a winning strategy, or anything in between. So, Jonathan, thinking about the span of your career so far, what successes stand out to you and why?
Well, the first one I've already touched on a bit was like that magazine that we launched when I joined Net Registry, which is about 15 years ago now. It was available in newsagents as well as sent out free to subscribers and so on. So this wasn't just like, a company magazine that gets sent out and people just pop straight in the bin. Most of the time, I wonder how many of those actually get out of the plastic wrapping, because it's like, we didn't necessarily ask for that. But this one was actually written to be appealing to people who, whether they were customers, whether they were not customers, whatever stage of their journey into digital business they were at. It was called Net Magazine, for anyone out there who still remembers it. And it won a few awards at the time for custom magazines. And when I started being involved, it gradually got more and more entrusted to me in terms of managing the client or Net Registry's involvement in the magazine, making sure that it aligned with what we wanted to put in the magazine, but without obviously being salesy, because this is, you want people to be reading this on the loo and being inspired to do something. You don't want to feel like you're pitching them, except, if it's in an advert. And that for me was my first sort of lesson in how to communicate digital concepts or technical concepts in a way that my mum could understand, because that's what the magazine needed to do. It needed to provide that simple advice or that simple inspiration in a lot of cases. So that was important to me because it was my first sort of lesson in how good marketing content could work. And it was also successful in terms of it won the awards. It ran for quite a few years. And I got my first award as a result of the column that I was writing for it. So that's what convinced me that, okay, I'm on the right track. Another one that probably I should mention too is from that, because I became known for writing that column in certain circles, that actually led me to form a relationship with the Content Marketing Institute in the United States. They actually approached me. Sarah Mitchell actually approached me to write for their magazine that they were just launching. And so I began writing a column for them, which I still write occasionally even now, so more than 10 years later. And that taught me to, because what they wanted from what I'd been writing for Net and what they want me to repeat for them was the way that I write is very personal. It's very illustrative in the sense of I don't just say, here is how you do X. I will take people through here is my experience of doing X, and here is what I've learned along the way, and trying to frame things in a way that are more relatable because they're stories, which is what we're talking about. So that was a massive success for me in terms of it took me to the next level and allowed me to actually hone my craft as a content marketer, because suddenly I discovered that's apparently what I was. The third example I want to just briefly mention was a white paper that I produced with an agency in Australia a few years ago called, it was for, again, a B2B digital company that releases software for business intelligence in large organizations, data and analysis stuff, which again is usually extremely dry. And the way that the agency who brought me in and we agreed that we were going to enliven this piece up was to make it one extended analogy to James Bond, to the Q branch within the James Bond movies. It's like the business intelligence capability within your business is the same as, for example, the Q branch in the James Bond films, where he supplies them with the intelligence that they need and the tools that they need and so on to be able to achieve their mission in the field. And so we had fun being able to like draw those parallels between certain messages that we want to get across, and the creative looked amazing and all the rest of it, and the client was extremely happy. And that's where the reason I bring up that example was because it wasn't necessarily a success for me in terms of, financial or anything like that. I get paid the same as long as I've delivered the brief. It doesn't matter to me whether, that it failed for the client or not, because a lot of that's in their hands. But for me, it was very much a creative success, and that any content writer or freelancer or person that you work with will tell you, it's like, we write dry, listicle, white paper, meh stuff so often, and that's bread and butter. Don't necessarily stop. But if you give us a little more room to move, or you allow us to be more creative, those are the projects we want. Those are the projects where we are able to unleash our full capabilities for you and produce something that will, A, keep us engaged with your brand, and B, make us feel more satisfied as writers. And I think that's an important point to get across.
I love that you're able to take a rather dry content project like a white paper and theme it around James Bond. It's certainly one of the more creative approaches I've heard in a good while. The follow-up question I have for you then, Jonathan, is how do you get buy-in from the people you report to be more creative?
Yes, it is hard sometimes for the reasons I've said before, where there's this idea about what professional content should look like. We're a B2B company, we need to talk in a certain way or be a certain way. And firstly, it's like making sure that they actually understand who their audience is. One of my favorite examples, that's not mine, but it's one I like to bring up a lot because it illustrates, again, the same point, was one that was produced by SunGuard Systems in the US in 2013. So it's about nearly 10 years old now. It won a lot of awards at the time. It's extremely creative. What they were selling or writing about was disaster recovery for large enterprises, data recovery, data centers, how to back up and all the rest of it, which is, again, there's so much content out there. There's so many businesses doing this, and most of this content is pretty dry, straightforward, instructional, nothing, you read it because you have to, not because you want to. SunGuard produced a piece of content called The Zombie Apocalypse Survival Guide, which took the idea of disaster recovery and mapped it to how all the steps involved in that, or how you should protect your business, and map them to how you would survive after a zombie apocalypse. It takes it takes preparation, it takes having the right tools. It's so they married these things together to make this point, and then crafted it in an amazing looking creative, and had a social media campaign and all the various bells and whistles around it, and it was very, very successful. They got a huge spike in leads out of it compared to their previous campaigns. And having worked with so many, IT businesses, web hosts, and so on over the years who do stick with this dry, supposedly professional approach, what I keep saying to them is, like, SunGuard understood who their audience is. If you look at the IT team within a business, if you go into any business and find, that little corner office where the IT team is huddled over their laptops, working on some weird code that I would never recognize. The 9 times out of 10, they'll be sat there wearing a Walking Dead t-shirt with loads of nerd stuff all over their desk. So what they were doing is, like, they understood who they were talking to, and they appealed to them and said, yeah, we get it. We're into the same cool stuff, but still got the information across that they wanted to get to these people. Now, whether those people were directly the decision maker within the B2B organization, or whether they then are influencing the people who will then make a decision, knowing your audience's interests beyond the work that they do, I think, is a very good way of finding new and interesting ways to appeal to them.
Amazing. I am for sure going to track down that piece of content around the survival guide a la zombie apocalypse, and we'll be sure to pop it in the show
Yeah,
notes so our listeners can go and have a look at that, because I certainly want to see that myself, just out of sheer curiosity. That sounds incredible.
it is. And I mean, like, this is going, that's sort of like at the extreme. I'm not saying every business needs to make every piece of content completely out there, completely wacky. How far can we push this? It's not about that. I mean, like, that's like saying, you can push it much further than you possibly think you can. But it's at its basic level is like going, don't just stop at the initial idea. The brief will be, we need a white paper that talks about X, and then that brief will often go out to the writer pretty much saying that, and the writer will deliver the brief. If you develop or are willing to develop the content idea a little bit more before you get to that stage, before you brief it out, or even in collaboration with the writer, say, look, we want to add to this. If you can come up with like that second idea to add to it, that will make you that you will use as an analogy, or create a unique angle to tell this story that your competitors aren't using, that will give the writer more creative latitude to play with, and B, create hopefully a piece of content that will stand out from all the other pieces of content on the same topic. So I think it's about not stopping at the first idea, which is usually the obvious idea. This is what it's about. And it's like, usually that's what the brief says. We want that. It's like, well, yes, that's what it's about, but what can we add to that? That's the second idea. That's the creative layer that you need to add to that before I think you should be briefing out your content.
Incredible. That's some great advice. And certainly when it comes to briefing out content, you're right. I mean, we've all been there, done that, where you're putting together a brief and you're getting it out the door because you know that that content will take time to develop. You've got timelines to keep. So just taking a moment of pause and being like, oh, how can we add an extra layer of fun or humanness to this, in terms of storytelling? I love that.
Yeah, but it's also just that it's remembering is like, and I don't think enough content projects start with this, is like looking at what's already out there. They look at their internal sort of needs, or what they what the messages they want to get out, and what their existing content says. We need a piece of content that talks about blah. But then, go and Google, and you'll see, you might put in those keywords and suddenly find that the whole first page of Google is already full of articles that pretty much have the same title or offering the same information. It's like, your content has to sit within that. How is it going to stand out, and how are you going to make sure that people choose yours over theirs? And I think that's an important part of the process, to understand why you need to take that extra step instead of just repeat. Because if you just stop at that first step, you're stopping at exactly where everybody else is stopping. And every one of you and your competitors will push out the same blog posts, the same white papers, and you could swap the logos around and no one would know the difference. So you need to find something to go, oh, I remember that came from that brand because no one else does content like this. You want to be remembered for that.
Such great advice, Jonathan. Thank you.
You were in some of the directors' meetings and executives and management meetings that I sometimes am in, because often it takes a little more convincing for them to see that than you.
I bet. Well, I really appreciate you sharing on some of the, standout successes that you've had, and also some advice on how to make those happen in terms of getting buy-in and taking a moment to reflect and pause. So this brings us to the second section of the episode, where we have a little chat about mistakes, because of course there's heaps of value that can come from talking about the challenges that we come up against and how we pivot and learn and grow from these. So with that in mind, thinking again over the span of your career, Jonathan, what are a few examples of failures that you've had, and what did you learn from these?
Well, the first one I had, or the one that sticks in me more as the lesson that was hard won, was, again, sort of back in my first job in this industry. And I was convincing the boss of the business that they needed to have a blog on the website. This is 2007, 2008. And it was like, we don't have a blog. It would give us another outlet to be able to produce a lot of content and yada, yada, yada. And because I really wanted to start developing this idea of content marketing. I wanted to be doing more. I didn't want to just be writing product pages. And he wasn't interested. No, we've got bigger priorities. It's a waste of time. We've got better things for you to be doing, which I knew was a mistake, because I knew that's what all of the competitors were doing, and I knew that's how you build a bigger footprint online. And after back and forth for a few weeks of him just basically knocking back whatever arguments I had, I decided to appeal to what he values most, which was I pitched it back into him again and said, they're great for SEO because we can attract traffic and so on. And that was what sold him. So it's like, oh, okay, let's do it for SEO, because he was all about SEO at that time. He wanted to drive Google traffic. So suddenly he approved the blog. But then the only metrics he was interested in for anything that I did with the blog was how it had improved the Google rankings for certain keywords. How, it's like he wasn't interested in how much engagement there was. He wasn't interested in what the topic I was writing about. He didn't care about what I was actually writing. He was only interested in, but where are we for this keyword? Have you written about this keyword this week? And what I learned from that was SEO should never wag the dog. Content marketing or writing good content isn't about SEO. SEO is about helping people to find your best content. So that was what I learned from that, was never pitch in content as an SEO strategy or undermine what I know the strategy should be because I'm trying to get them to approve it. That was the hard-won lesson. And I've had a love-hate relationship with SEO ever since. Other mistakes I've had over the years, or things where I've learned, have been when I haven't pushed back enough on the client to say, you know what, this is boring, or I've already written this white paper 3 times this month for other people. Do you need to, come up with something else? Sometimes, as we were saying before, is you don't have the opportunity. You've got to, turn around so much work to be able to get your invoices out and get your stuff up. And if that's what they've asked for, that's what they've asked for. If bad posh. But sometimes, there's an opportunity to have that conversation with the client. And if I miss that, and then they come back and go, nah, this content marketing stuff isn't really working for us. And, I want to say, well, there's a better way to do it, but I've missed the opportunity. Because if at that point they're going to say, well, why have you wasted time? Why didn't you just do that in the first place? And so there's an element of I learned very early on to be willing to pitch in what I think they should be doing and say, look, there's a better way. We could do, if you want to just allocate a little bit more time, we could do this, or we could, instead of doing this as a blog post, it should be a video. You could do something much better with this. And if they then say no, and then it falls over, then I can at least say, well, I did advise you, or I did say, but I can't be blameless if I didn't offer that advice in the first place.
That's such a valuable learning to have had, because I think it can be tricky, right? Especially when you're doing that sort of client work and they're saying, we want this, and you think, oh, easy done. I can absolutely do that. But it's almost having that creative courage, right? To say, this is fine, but I have some ideas that would help elevate this if you're on board. Yeah. It is that being willing to back yourself and your creative approach, right?
Yeah, and there is a little of knowing when to pick your battles as well. Particularly if it's a new client you've not worked with before, you might be less willing to be the guy in the marketing meeting who's saying, no, there's better, because, they'll just see you as a pain in the bum and probably not use you again. There is an element of finding ways to slowly nudge them in the right direction, or to show them a better idea that is less. This is something I struggle with, because I can be quite outspoken, particularly in meetings that are going the wrong way. And so it's so I developed a reputation at one point of being quite grumpy, but it was usually because I was saying, there's a better way. A better way to do that, to let people know there's a better way, if that doesn't sound clumsy, is to show rather than tell. I've got this on a separate project for someone else at the moment. It's where they've asked for something. Yes, we can do that. there's loads of limitations around it. But like what we're going to decided to pitch to them instead is like, here's what it'll look like if we follow your brief. Here's what it would look like if we were able to do X, Y, Z with it. No, obviously, you don't want to do all of that work just to show them the example, but just to illustrate the pros and cons of that. And then it's up to them to make the decision about whether, they want to allocate a bit more time or budget to do that or whatever. But then they own that decision. If that falls down for the reasons that we pointed out, like no one's going to read that because they've already read it 10 times, then that's on them, But I think it's more about showing them what's possible rather than just being the person that says, no, you're doing it wrong. Well, there's this principle from improv, in acting, where the whole idea, you get actors and they'll do this on stage as an acting exercise or whatever. It's like when someone starts doing a scene or takes it in a certain direction, it's like the other person doesn't sort of go, oh, that's not where I thought this was going to go, and then try and push it back the other way. They go, yes, and. They've got this idea of like, yes, and. Take what's been presented and add to it. Yes, and then it sort of goes back and forward like that. And I think we need to take that approach with content as well. So like, the brief might come in, and then when we come back, it's like we're taking the brief, but going yes, and on top to say like, we could also do this. And that hopefully might then spark more of a creative collaboration, but at least it's less aggressive than trying to say, no, your brief is wrong, we should be doing it this way, because guess what, they're just going to dig their heels in and say, no, we're the client, this is the brief.
It's very true. Well then, Jonathan, this leads in quite nicely to the next question, which is, what's a rookie mistake you've made that's kind of funny in hindsight?
Oh, crikey. There's always the things of sending the wrong draft through. I try to be organized on, my various devices and have them syncing through Dropbox and so on. So I've, version control and so on. But I'm also naturally disorganized in like file names and things like that. So, sweating all week on a piece of content and submitting the email at 6:00 on a Friday with the attachment and sending it through and going, that's job done. And then getting the email on the Monday, like saying, hang on, there's a whole section missing, or, you've left in this bit. I think the worst example of that was where I shared the wrong version of the Google Doc with the client. And so they were able to see where I'd added comments at certain points on a previous version that was only meant to be internal, where I was a little like we were just talking about, like, how you explain better ways of doing things. Internally, I was, the way I was explaining things was a little more frustrated, shall we say. And that was the version I shared with the client. And I had to sort of like, oh, no, that's not what I meant. So version control and being, even when you think these comments are internal, sort of like remembering that maybe at some point, whether it's you or whether it's someone else, they might somehow find their way to a wider audience. Like, it's like always write as if your mum's watching, basically,
Well, next question then, Jonathan. What advice would you give your younger self?
Oh, crikey. Well, firstly, when I was thinking about this, it's like the first thought I had was like, go back to myself when I was like 19 and don't major in radio at university. There's a computer graphics lab down the hallway, and your mates are all majoring in that on the same course. And their jobs are much more fun now. I trained myself in redundant skills that were rapidly going out of fashion at the wrong time. So that would be the first thing, is like, don't just do things because I just found radio more fun, so I chose to do it. But thinking have the long term in view. That was the first thing that sprang to mind. The one lesson, and I've mentioned this before already, that I think my younger self needed to know was storytelling is in everything. because I was so obsessed, like I said before at the time, when I went to uni and so on, it was because I wanted to tell stories. I wanted to write radio drama. I wanted to, work in TV and write Doctor Who or whatever. So it was all about, I want to tell stories. When storytelling really applies far beyond just those fields, it applies to marketing, it applies to communication. It's how, in a lot of ways, that we talk to each other. There's almost always a narrative behind whatever it is that we're saying. So I think it was like, broaden your ideas of what storytelling is, because there are other opportunities out there for you.
Thinking across the span of your career so far, Jonathan, what's been the most interesting or fascinating change that you've seen in the industry?
I think, because I started more as a writer than anything else in the industry, I was writing articles. I was trained in audio and video and all the rest of it. But I found myself writing. And that's really where the industry was when I started. It was about blogs. It was about, articles. It was about white papers. And then, of course, over the years, other rich media has become much more prevalent: podcasts, video, etc., infographics even. And that has been more exciting because it challenges me too, because I'm a writer first and foremost. My first instinct is to write about something. It's an article. That's the first thing I see. And now it's more a case of like, well, is it though? Should this be a podcast? Should this be an infographic? Is there a better way to present this so that you're providing alternative ways for the audience to consume the information? Should it be all three? Repurposing the same content in different mediums so that people can really choose how they consume it. And I think that's been the most exciting, is like seeing these other channels become more established and easier to produce, which means I have been more recently able to use some of those radio skills I wasn't able to use in the early days by, producing podcasts and getting the mic out and doing all these things. So I think that's been, I think, the most exciting for me. And the lesson being like, do not limit your toolkit. All of it is available now, and all of it is far easier to create than maybe a lot of people think.
Absolutely. And so looking then to what's to come, what excites you about the future of the industry?
I think it's because, we're having conversations like this about storytelling is one. I remember a few years ago, storytelling was a buzzword in the field for a while. And then there was like a bit of a backlash. I was seeing articles being shared on LinkedIn about the days of storytelling are over. It was a fad in marketing. It was a buzzword. It's not what it's about. We've got to get sales and yada, yada, yada. And which at the time I was annoyed by, because I thought that fundamentally missed the point of what storytelling is. It's not storytelling as a practice in marketing isn't just turning everything into a case study about one person or, telling things like that. It's about narrative. It's about how you create those scenarios in someone's head. There's a lot more to it, and it ties into rhetoric and a lot of other areas of communication. So I feel we're at a point now where storytelling has become more accepted once more and seen as a inescapable part of communication, never mind marketing. And so like, whether we realize it or not, even if you're writing a listicle that seems on the surface quite clinical and matter of fact, in a sense it's part of a story, that because you're creating, as we were saying before, it's like, the reader's mind will add the context. They'll say what that information means to them. So you're helping to build a story in their mind. And that's how we communicate with each other. So I think it's understanding that, and understanding that there's always a narrative. If you're not aware of what your narrative is, or you're not thinking about what that narrative is across the scope of your content, then you're probably losing control of what that narrative is. So I think that's the point there, is like, storytelling needs to be considered not only at the individual content level in terms of how, does this create the right story in the mind of the reader, but over the entire content journey that a reader might go through. Whereas as they go on their quest to solve whatever the problem might be, you've got to you can easily map a 3-act journey of like awareness to research to solving the quest at the end, which is a story. So being able to, there's loads of ways that storytelling can be woven into what we do, and I'm glad to see that this is now becoming more common and not rejected as a buzzword or a fad from a few years ago.
But look, speaking on the topic of narrative and storytelling, you're set to return as a guest judge for the 7th Annual Shorthand Awards, which is so exciting, and we're so thrilled to have you back on the panel. So in your view, Jonathan, what makes a story stand out from the crowd?
It's got to hold your attention to the end. I mean, that's number one with a bullet. That's what a story should do. If you're not interested in how it turns out, then it's not going to work. You never watch a movie and they tell you how the hero is going to overcome the odds. That's never act one, because then you've got no reason to keep watching to find out how they solve it. The stakes have to be lifted. So it's about how you hold the attention. There's a trend in some content, particularly sort of like in case studies, that which to me feels like they've taken the wrong lesson from journalism, which is like, up front you've got to say what this is about. It's almost like the conclusion comes first, and so you have this case study which says, Angela was able to save her business X amount by using da 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 da. So, well, now I don't need to read the case study. It's like you've told me what happens at the end. So it's more a case of like, I would be saying, good storytelling would start with like, what's the problem Angela's got to solve, then the various barriers and issues that she had to overcome along the way, and then, wow, she managed to solve it with your product or whatever at the end of it. Otherwise, people are not going to get that far. So in the sense of beyond case studies, all content sort of works that way. How can you get them from this paragraph to the next paragraph? How much are you leaving to their imagination so that they are interested in what comes next? If the moment they feel that they've got what you're trying to say, it'll become boring. So it's like, how are you going to keep their attention? Sometimes that might be around holding some information back until the end. It could be about raising the stakes. It could be about, introducing emotion, which is another hook, which B2B doesn't use enough. It could be about, a progression of ideas so that one builds on the other. So, each time you're prompting their curiosity just a little bit more to keep them going. But that's what good content should do, to hold their attention to the end.
So, Jonathan, I'm really curious to know then, what's your favourite piece of content on the web?
Well, I've already mentioned the Zombie Apocalypse Survival Guide, which is one that I've keep going back to. Is like, I'm really impressed by that one. So that's that. But I was a big fan for this is another old example though, but it's one again that stuck with me, of how a brand can get away with pushing the envelope. And it's the old example of like, Will It Blend? Do you remember the whole Will It Blend video series? And that was because they took something that was pretty functionary. It's a blender, and they wanted to, their marketing challenge was people did not understand why this particular brand of blender cost so much more than the other ones there. And so they wanted to demonstrate why this blender was a much higher quality, what else it could do. And so by creating the Will It Blend YouTube series, they were able to not only illustrate it, but by doing it in a way that was interactive with the audience. Tell us what you want us to stick in the blender. And they blended everything from, CDs to granite blocks to glow sticks to, iPhones and all the rest of it. As a story, I suppose there's a beginning, middle, and end, because you've got, the guy like saying, will it? So you've got that, hook of like, I want to know what happens to this thing. So you've got that hook at the beginning, then you've got the actual process itself, and then you've got the outcome at the end. So on a very basic level, it still follows that structure, but it's also that narrative, which is why that campaign was so important to them, because it was about demonstrating a feature of the product that their target audience was struggling to understand. So we often talk about how creative that campaign was, but underneath it was a very, very clear marketing tactic that it did extremely well. That's why I still sort of like think of that, the simplicity of that idea, when I'm trying to think of solutions for marketing issues today, because I thought that was just so elegant what they did.
So look, I'll be sure to pop a link in the show notes to some of the Will It Blend content for anyone looking to see that in action. If you haven't seen it before, it is surprisingly compelling. All right, Jonathan, if you had a captive audience of 100,000 people and a microphone in your hand, what would you want that audience to know about you, your work, or your approach to storytelling?
Firstly, that I view everything through this lens. As I said before, is like at some level, everything forms part of a story or a narrative. And so I'm always looking for that second angle. I'm always looking for that. What can I add? It's about creativity above anything else. I think if we're not being more creative with our content, if we're not willing to push our ideas just that little bit further, which doesn't have to take much, it just needs to be a little bit further than everybody else, then your content is just noise. It becomes noise. It's repeating what's already out there. Let's face it, if you're looking to solve a problem on the internet these days, chances are someone's already got the answer out there in their ebook, in their blog post, in their whatever. So your content actually needs to do more. It's not enough to do content now. Your content has to be exceptional. So that's the thing I get on my soapbox over and over again to tell people is like, push yourself. Be willing to take risks. Be willing to drop this dry, uninteresting, patrician in many ways persona that a lot of B2B businesses have, and be willing to be human, because that's what people will relate to. That's the stuff that they will remember.
Here's to more human-centered, human-centric writing and content.
Yes.
So Jonathan, it wouldn't be an episode of The Craft if we didn't have a listener challenge. So to finish off our chat today, what challenge would you like to give listeners for this episode?
Well, after everything I've said, I think the most obvious challenge is next time that you are developing a piece of content, you're in that whiteboard session with the rest of the team and you're putting up, okay, here are the blog post articles for this month or the white paper or for this quarter or whatever the case may be. Don't stop at the first idea. You've written on the board, we need a white paper with, 6 ways to do X, that title or whatever. Don't stop there. Spend a little bit more time going, what's the additional idea that we can add to that will make it something else, that will make it something new, more likely something unique. So whether that be adding zombies to it or James Bond, as I said before, or whether it's adding a different perspective, as in like, let's talk about this topic from the point of view of a particular customer that's not been talked about before, or a particular situation that makes it very, very specific and different to what's already out there. Whatever the case may be, but like, what's the second idea that you can add to that? That's the challenge I want to set.
Amazing. Well, look, for our listeners, if you do give Jonathan's challenge a try, send us some links or tag us on your socials. And if you do end up making a zombie apocalypse themed piece, I'd love to see it. Well, look, Jonathan, thank you again for joining me on this episode and sharing all your insights into how you approach B2B content and make it more human and engaging and based around narrative and story. It's just been brilliant having you on. So thank you.
It's been fun.
Brilliant. What an episode of The Craft, Jonathan provided so much excellent advice around elevating your B2B content and finding some inspiration to make it stand out from the crowd. We have a lot of amazing guests lined up for future, but if you'd like to come on and talk about content and storytelling on the web, please do get in touch. You can find all the details you need in the show notes. Thank you again for tuning into today's episode of The Craft. And until next time, happy storytelling.
Thank you for checking out this episode of The Craft. This show is brought to you by Shorthand, a platform that helps professional content creators produce beautiful stories without writing a single line of code. If you enjoyed what you learned in this episode, make sure to follow The Craft wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Or visit shorthand.com/podcast to get immediate access to all the latest episodes.